She was standing in the doorway of the house we used to share, holding a bottle of wine I hadn't asked for, wearing the navy dress she knew I'd always loved on her. And she said, "Can we just have one more night? Before all of this is final." My name is David. I'm 44 years old. I've spent the last 18 years designing buildings in Savannah, Georgia. Churches converted into lofts. Old cotton warehouses turned into offices with exposed brick and steel that clients pay a premium to call authentic. I'm good at my job because I understand structure, how weight moves through a building, where the load-bearing walls actually are versus where people assume they must be. It's a strange thing, looking back, that I spent my whole career understanding what holds a structure up while somehow missing every sign that the one holding up my own life had been quietly failing for over a year. On the night this story really opens, I was standing in the doorway of an apartment that had become mine over 6 increasingly strange months, holding the door only halfway, feeling 12 years of marriage pulling at my chest like gravity, trying to decide whether saying yes to her would be an act of love or the last mistake I'd let myself make with this woman. I want to take you back, though, all the way back, because you don't arrive at a moment like that one without walking through a long hallway of smaller moments first, most of which I didn't recognize as doors quietly closing until I was already standing on the other side of every one of them. Claire and I met at a mutual friend's wedding when I was 32 and she was 27. I remember the exact moment. She was standing near the bar in a green dress, laughing at something one of the bridesmaids had said, and the laugh carried clean across a crowded reception hall and landed somewhere in my chest before I'd even walked over to introduce myself. I thought, watching her that night, that I'd found someone who made rooms feel less empty just by being inside them. 18 months later, we were married in a small ceremony under live oaks dripping with Spanish moss, the kind of wedding photograph that ends up framed in every room of a house for the next decade. We built a life together, a restored Victorian near Forsyth Park with a wraparound porch I'd redesigned myself, a son named Jack who was 9 years old that year, and deep in the particular obsession 9-year-old boys develop with dinosaurs, reciting Latin names at the dinner table with more confidence than I had about most things in my own life. From the outside, our marriage looked, by every visible measure, like it was working. We hosted dinner parties. We took a family trip to the coast every summer. Claire's mother used to tell people we were the couple who actually made it look easy. I'm the kind of man who avoids conflict the way some people avoid heights. Not, I always told myself, out of weakness, but out of a genuine belief that peace was worth protecting, even at the cost of a hard conversation neither of us particularly wanted to have. If Claire seemed tired, I let it go. If a silence stretched a little too long at dinner, I filled it with something easy instead of asking what was underneath it. I understand now that there's a real difference between keeping the peace and actually building something honest, but I didn't understand that yet. Not on the ordinary Tuesday, 8 months before she stood in my doorway holding that bottle of wine, when this story really begins. That Tuesday started like 100 others. Claire came home late from a showing, her hair slightly damp in a way that struck me, in passing, as odd for someone who'd spent the evening walking clients through empty houses. When I asked how her day was, she said, "Fine," in a tone that closed the conversation before it had a chance to open. I didn't think much of it. Not yet. I made dinner. We ate at the counter because Jack had already eaten and was upstairs building something elaborate out of Lego, and the evening folded itself into the ordinary shape of every other evening that year. But something in the air that night had shifted in a way I couldn't quite name, a faint static I chose not to investigate. And it would be months before I understood exactly what I'd been standing next to without seeing it at all. Claire had been in real estate for almost a decade by then, good at it in the particular way people become good at things that let them stay endlessly, restlessly busy. She had a gift for reading a room within 30 seconds of walking into it, for knowing exactly which detail of a house to highlight for exactly which buyer. I used to love watching her work a showing, the way she transformed a listing into a story someone wanted to live inside. That spring, she'd started working more and more closely with a developer named Tyler, who was buying up parcels of the historic district and flipping them for numbers that made even me, an architect who should have known better, a little uneasy about what the city was quietly becoming. I'd met Tyler twice, briefly, at open houses Claire had asked me to stop by after work. He was younger than us by close to a decade, easy with a handshake, wearing the kind of confidence that reads as charm right up until you've had enough time around it to recognize it as something closer to entitlement. I didn't have that time. I shook his hand, admired the crown molding he was preserving in a federal-style row house on Jones Street, and went back to my own work without thinking about him again for weeks. Around that time, Claire started working later, a showing that ran long, a closing that needed extra paperwork on a Friday evening, a client dinner she should probably go to for the relationship, she'd say, already halfway into her coat before I could ask which client. I didn't ask many follow-up questions. I told myself that was trust. I understand now that some of it genuinely was trust. 12 years of it, earned honestly. And some of it was simply easier than asking a question I was afraid might have an answer I wasn't ready to hear. One evening, loading the dishwasher, I noticed she'd started keeping her phone in her handbag instead of on the kitchen counter charger, where it had lived, without exception, for years. A small, unremarkable habit change. I noticed it the way you notice a picture frame that's been moved an inch to the left. Aware, mildly curious, not alarmed. I didn't say anything. Conflict avoidance doesn't announce itself as a flaw while you're living inside it. It just feels like being easygoing, right up until the moment, much later, when you understand exactly what that ease actually cost you. Jack, oblivious in the specific way children are gifted at being oblivious to the right things while remaining sharply alert to the wrong ones, mentioned one Saturday morning over cereal that Mom's friend Tyler had picked him up from soccer practice the previous Tuesday because Claire had a showing that ran over. I hadn't known that. I remember setting my coffee mug down a little too hard on the counter, a small physical tell I didn't examine at the time. "That's nice of him," I said, and Jack shrugged and went back to his cereal, already bored of the topic, and I filed the detail away in the part of my mind reserved for things too small to matter yet. Not suspicious, exactly. Just slightly, quietly wrong. The way a floor creaks differently once you know there's something underneath it. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever looked back on a stretch of your own life and realized you were handed a dozen small chances to ask a real question, and let every single one of them pass because the not knowing felt more survivable than the knowing might be, you already understand the particular blindness I'm describing. It isn't stupidity. It's a kind of self-protection that costs you more, eventually, than the thing you were protecting yourself from in the first place. Claire's best friend Monica came over for dinner one Friday around this time. The three of us, Claire, Monica, and I, sitting on the back porch with a bottle of wine while Jack ran through the sprinkler in the yard below, and at one point, when Claire had gone inside to get more ice, Monica said something strange, almost by accident, the kind of comment that slips out before someone's caught it. "She seems different lately. Lighter, I don't know. Good for her, I guess." I asked what she meant. Monica's face did something quick and complicated, a flicker of something she immediately tried to smooth over, before she said, "Nothing, just busy season, probably," and reached for her wine glass with a little too much purpose, changing the subject fast enough that I noticed the swerve even if I didn't yet understand what she was swerving away from. That swerve sat with me longer than I expected it to. I told myself I was reading too much into an offhand comment. I didn't think about it again until nearly 3 weeks later. I should have. The weeks that followed brought other small, deniable things. A new lipstick shade I didn't recognize on a coffee mug in the sink. A gym membership she'd signed up for that I never once saw her actually attend, based on the schedule she kept. A Tuesday night girls' dinner with Monica that Monica, when I mentioned it in passing weeks later, had no memory of at all. Each detail, alone, was nothing, the kind of thing any reasonable person could explain away in half a sentence. Together, slowly, they were building toward a shape I still wasn't ready to look at directly. The weeks that followed brought a version of Claire I hadn't seen in years. Quicker to laugh at dinner, humming under her breath while she got ready in the mornings, newly and visibly attentive to things about herself she'd mostly stopped paying attention to somewhere in the grind of the last decade. A new workout routine that actually stuck. A haircut she didn't mention getting until I noticed it myself, 2 full days late, standing behind her at the bathroom mirror. "You cut your hair," I said, and she met my eyes in the mirror for just a beat too long before answering. "Couple days ago. You're just now noticing." I told myself this new lightness in her was good for us. Good for our marriage even. I wanted to believe that more than I wanted to look closely enough to find out whether it was actually true. She told me, much later, what those weeks had actually felt like from her side of things. I told myself it was harmless at first. Tyler and I talking business over coffee, working through the Bull Street numbers, nothing that should have felt like anything more than two colleagues collaborating. But he asked me questions nobody had asked me in years. Not what the closing needed, not what Jack's soccer schedule required, not what dinner should be. He asked what I actually wanted, for myself, separate from every role I'd been filling for over a decade. I hadn't realized how hungry I was for that question until someone finally offered it to me. I told myself one dinner wouldn't hurt anything. Then one more. I kept repeating the same sentence to myself every single time, right up until the sentence stopped being true and I stopped believing it even as I said it. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. Instead, in real time, I kept noticing small things and quietly, methodically talking myself out of their meaning. A receipt for dinner at a downtown restaurant. Dated a night, she'd told me she was showing a property clear across town in Ardsley Park. A faint trace of a perfume that wasn't hers, layered under her own scent on a blazer, she hung up a little too quickly the moment I walked into our shared closet. Her phone, once lighting up on the nightstand at 11 at night with a contact name I didn't recognize, Tyler D. And a message preview visible for a full 2 seconds before she reached over and flipped it face down without a single word of explanation. I asked that time. I actually asked, my voice coming out more casual than I felt. "Who's Tyler D?" "Client," she said, too fast, already reaching for her book on the nightstand. "The developer from the Bull Street project. Don't worry about it. It's just work stuff, contracts and closing dates." I let it go. Not because the answer satisfied me. It didn't, not even slightly, but because some part of me had already quietly decided that not knowing, for a little while longer, was easier to carry than whatever waited on the other side of actually asking a second question. There was a Sunday afternoon, a few weeks later, when Claire and I argued. A real argument, rare for us, about something as small as whether to sell my late mother's old lake house, a property we'd inherited and never quite decided what to do with. "I'm not ready to let go of it," Claire said, more sharply than the topic seemed to warrant. And I remember being surprised by the heat in her voice over a house neither of us had visited in 2 years. I didn't understand, in that moment, that she wasn't really talking about the lake house at all. I filed the phrase away without recognizing it as the thing it actually was. The first appearance of 5 words that would come to define the next year of both our lives. 3 weeks before I found out the whole truth, I found a second phone in the glove compartment of Claire's car while looking for a parking garage ticket. An old prepaid model I didn't recognize, dead battery, buried under a stack of car manuals, and an expired insurance card, like something deliberately meant to stay forgotten. I sat in the driveway of our own house for a long moment, engine off, holding it in my palm, turning it over like it might rearrange itself into something less obvious than what it clearly, unmistakably was. Looking back now, that was the moment I should have finally asked the question I'd been circling for months. I had the entire answer sitting in my hand, dead battery and all, and I put it back exactly where I'd found it, tucked under the same manuals, because some stubborn, frightened part of me still wasn't ready to let the not knowing end. If I had charged that phone that same night instead of 2 weeks later, I believe everything that followed would have gone very differently. I spent the better part of the following 2 weeks becoming someone I genuinely didn't recognize, a man quietly, methodically building a case against his own marriage, one receipt, and one unexplained late night at a time. I told myself I was simply gathering information, being thorough, the same way I'd approach any structural problem at work. It felt, at times, like the only thing keeping me from falling apart entirely. I found a credit card charge at a downtown hotel, dated an afternoon Claire had told me she'd spent at an open house on Habersham Street. I found 4 separate calls to the same unlisted number over a single week, always clustered on the evenings she came home latest, always lasting between 40 and 90 minutes. I found, on a Saturday when Claire took Jack to his grandmother's for the day, a folder tucked inside her home office desk drawer labeled Simply Personal. Inside it, printed directions to a lake house 2 hours outside the city that neither of us owned, dated the previous month. Monica called me one evening around this time, her voice strange and tight in a way I'd never heard from her before. "Hey, can we talk sometime?" "Not right now, just sometime, when Claire's not around." I told her sure. Of course, and then let 3 full days pass without following up, too afraid of what she might actually say if I finally gave her the chance to say it out loud. I understand now, looking back, that Monica had been trying, in her own conflicted and imperfect way, to warn me. Caught between a decade of loyalty to her closest friend and a growing discomfort she genuinely didn't know how to carry alone anymore. Even now, remembering that unanswered phone call sitting on my kitchen counter for 3 days, something uncomfortable moves through my chest. The specific sense that the truth had been standing patiently outside my own front door for days, and I was the one, again, who kept it waiting in the heat. There was a night, during that same stretch, when I drove past the hotel from the credit card statement almost without meaning to. A route home I told myself was faster, though I knew, even as I made the turn, exactly what I was actually doing. I sat in my truck across the street for nearly 20 minutes, watching the entrance, feeling ridiculous and sick at the same time, and I didn't see her. I told myself that meant something reassuring. It didn't mean anything at all. I simply hadn't picked the right night. I finally charged the second phone on a Thursday evening, plugging it into a charger in my truck's center console, while Claire was out at what she'd told me, that morning, was a closing dinner for the Bull Street project. It powered on slowly, the old battery clearly failing, and revealed a single unread text thread with a contact saved simply as T. Months of messages stretching back further than I'd let myself estimate. Plans for meetings disguised as showings. A handful of photographs I made myself scroll past quickly without lingering on them. An entire second relationship laid out in a timeline more organized and consistent than most of the actual conversations Claire and I had managed to have with each other that whole year. I sat in my driveway with that phone for close to an hour, engine off, air conditioning slowly fading, sweat gathering at my collar in the June heat, reading and rereading the same handful of messages until the words stopped making new sense and just sat there, flat and undeniable, on a cracked secondhand screen. I didn't confront her that night. I told myself I needed time to prepare, to be sure I could get all the way through the conversation without falling apart in front of her the way I could already feel myself wanting to. Some of that reasoning was true. The rest of it, if I'm honest with myself even now, was simply fear, carefully dressed up to look like preparation. I didn't know it yet, but the phone sitting in my truck's glove compartment that night wasn't the last thing that week would show me. And the conversation waiting on the other side of it would cost me a version of my marriage I hadn't fully finished letting go of, even while I sat there holding the proof in my own 2 hands. I waited 2 more days. I told myself it was strategy. Really, it was dread. On Friday night, once Jack was finally asleep upstairs, his door cracked the way he liked it with the hallway light spilling in. I set the old prepaid phone on the kitchen table between Claire and me, screen up, the thread with T. Still open exactly where I'd left it 2 nights earlier. Claire's face went through several things at once when she saw it sitting there. First confusion, then recognition, then something that looked, unmistakably, closer to relief than to fear, like a breath she'd been holding for months was finally, involuntarily allowed to leave her body. She sat down slowly across from me, both hands flat on the table like she needed something solid to hold on to. "How long have you had that?" she said. Not quite a question. More like she already knew the answer and was only confirming the shape of it. "Long enough," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt for the first 2 sentences, and then, on the third, it cracked slightly in a way that embarrassed me even in the moment. "How long, Claire?" "All of it. I need to hear you actually say the words." "Almost 7 months." She reached toward my hand across the table. I pulled mine back before she could close the distance, and something in her face flinched at that small, deliberate movement. "David, please, I need you to let me explain this the right way. Not just react to whatever's on that screen without any context." "You have 30 seconds, I said, "before I decide I don't want an explanation from you at all tonight." She nodded, slowly, and something in her posture shifted, not defensive exactly, more like a woman deciding, in real time, in front of me, to finally stop protecting a version of herself she'd been carefully protecting for the better part of a year. "It started with the Bull Street project," she said. "Tyler and I were working closely together, long hours, a lot of pressure with the closing timeline. There was a night after a client dinner ran late. The deal had nearly fallen through that afternoon, and I was furious. David, Genuinely furious in a way I don't think I even let myself be furious with you anymore. And instead of driving straight home, I sat in my car in the parking garage and cried for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself pull out. He knocked on my window. He didn't say anything particularly smart or comforting. He just sat in the passenger seat with me while I cried it out, and afterward he asked if I wanted a drink instead of driving straight home upset. I said yes. I told myself, driving to meet him, that it was one drink. Nothing that meant anything. I sat back hard against my chair. My hands, I noticed almost clinically, had started shaking slightly. A fine tremor I couldn't fully stop even gripping the edge of the table. So you found the answer to whatever you needed with him instead of coming home and finding it with me. I don't have an excuse that makes any of this okay, she said. And for the first time that night, her voice actually cracked, genuine and unguarded. I need you to understand that. But you asked me how, David, and I think I owe you the real answer. Not some cleaned-up version I've been rehearsing in my head for months to make myself look less terrible. Then give me the real one, I said. All of it. Tonight. I'm not doing this piece by piece over the next 6 months. She took a long breath, glanced once toward the staircase. Checking, I understood, that Jack was still asleep. And what came next was the most she had said to me, uninterrupted, and longer than I could actually remember. It didn't start as anything I planned, David. That's the truth, even if I know it doesn't sound like much of an excuse standing here now. Tyler and I were working the Bull Street deal for weeks, late nights, constant pressure, and there was that night in March I already told you about. The closing had just fallen through, and I was sitting in the parking garage crying, and he knocked on my window, and afterward we got a drink instead of me driving home upset. I told myself that was all it was. One drink. Nothing that meant anything at all. The first time something actually happened between us, I remember standing afterward in a hotel bathroom, looking at myself in that mirror, and thinking clearly, this isn't who I am, and then walking back out anyway, because some part of me had already, quietly decided I wasn't ready to give up how it felt to be looked at like that again, like a whole person instead of a role. I've never really told you this, David, not properly. My father left when I was 10. He just didn't come home one Tuesday. No fight, no warning, just gone, and my mother spent the next 6 months telling me it wasn't my fault while some part of me never fully believed her. I've never really told you how much of my entire adult life since then has been quietly built around one fear, that anyone who really sees me, all the way down, eventually leaves anyway, the same way he did. So some sick, twisted part of me told myself, if I found something new before you ever got the chance to eventually walk away from me the way he did, it wouldn't hurt the same way it did when I was 10 years old, standing in a driveway watching a car I'd never see again disappear around the corner. I kept choosing it, David, over and over. Every single time I told myself it would absolutely be the last time, and every single time I found some new reason it wasn't. I was terrified constantly, terrified of you finding out, terrified of what it meant about who I'd quietly let myself become, terrified most of all that I actually wanted both things at once and simply didn't know how to want only one of them cleanly. There were mornings, more than I want to admit to you right now, when I genuinely couldn't look at Jack's dinosaur drawings taped up on our refrigerator without feeling physically sick, because I understood exactly, precisely what I was risking every single time I chose to keep going instead of finally stopping. There was a night about 6 weeks ago. You'll probably remember it. Actually, it was a Tuesday, when I almost told you everything, all of it, right there in the kitchen. You asked me if something was wrong, and I had the entire truth sitting right there at the edge of my mouth, ready. And then Jack came running and asking about his science project on the solar system. And the moment passed, and I let it pass, David, because I was more afraid of your face in that specific moment than I was of everything I was already carrying alone. I don't expect you to forgive any of this tonight, and honestly, maybe not ever. But I need you to know, sitting here, that I never once meant for it to become what it became. I just genuinely didn't know how to stop myself once it had already started, and I think some small, terrible part of me didn't fully want to stop. Not because I ever stopped loving you, David, I promise you I never did, but because I was terrified of a version of love that could still, somehow, eventually leave me the way everything else always had. I sat with all of that for a long time, saying nothing, feeling something crack open in my chest that had nothing left to do with anger and everything to do with a grief I didn't yet have proper language for. I need you to leave, I said finally, once I trusted my own voice again. Not forever. Just tonight. I can't be in this house with you right now, Claire. I need the space to think without you sitting 3 feet away from me. She didn't argue with me, which somehow made the whole scene harder rather than easier. She packed a small bag quietly and left for Monica's apartment a little before midnight, and I sat alone at that kitchen table until the sun came up through the window over the sink, staring at the dead prepaid phone still sitting between us like the single, most honest object in the entire house. I didn't know it yet, but her leaving that night wasn't actually the end of anything at all. It was only the beginning of 6 of the strangest, most suspended months of my entire life. Because within a week, when I finally asked her to meet me and sign the divorce papers my lawyer had already drawn up, Claire looked at me across a conference table in Ruth's downtown office and said the 5 words that would come to define the rest of this story. The same 5 words she'd used months earlier about a lake house neither of us had visited in years. I'm not ready to let go. What followed wasn't the clean, quick ending I'd braced myself for. Claire didn't fight the affair itself anymore. She'd told me the truth, fully and without flinching, that night at the kitchen table. And to her credit, she never once tried to walk any of it back or soften it in the weeks that followed. What she fought, instead, was the finality of what came next. She missed the first signing appointment with a vague excuse about a showing that ran long. She missed the second one entirely, sending a text an hour beforehand that simply read, "I can't do this today. I'm sorry." My lawyer, a patient, sharp-eyed woman named Ruth who had clearly seen every possible version of this exact situation play out across her conference table over the years, told me something I've thought about often since. Some people can accept they've done something unforgivable far faster than they can accept the actual shape of what comes after it, she said, sliding the unsigned papers back into a folder for the second time. Give it time. Or don't. That's entirely your call, David, not mine. Tyler, for his part, disappeared from the story almost entirely once the affair stopped being a secret he could enjoy quietly and became, instead, a mess with visible consequences attached to it. His own wife, Rachel, found out within 2 weeks, not from me directly, though I didn't go out of my way to protect the secret once it was already out in the open air. Rachel filed for divorce herself less than a month later. I heard, secondhand through Monica, that she took their house in the settlement and moved to be near her sister in Charleston. Tyler's business partners, uneasy about the reputational mess of a client's husband finding out and the story quietly circulating through Savannah's fairly small real estate circle, eased him off 2 active downtown projects within the same quarter. Claire told me once, unprompted, that she hadn't spoken to him at all since the week everything came apart at that kitchen table. Whatever he'd offered her, it apparently required secrecy to survive, and secrecy was the one thing this particular story no longer had left to give either one of them. Monica, when I finally sat down with her for coffee weeks later, admitted what I'd already half suspected on my own. I knew for almost 2 months before you found out, she said, guilt written plainly across her whole face, both hands wrapped tight around her mug like she needed something to hold onto too. I told her, more than once, that she had to be the one to tell you herself, that I couldn't be the one to do it for her. I should have called you anyway, David. I've thought about that decision probably 100 times since. I told her, honestly, that I understood the impossible position she'd been put in. I'd spent enough of that same year avoiding hard conversations of my own to recognize, uncomfortably, the exact shape of someone else quietly doing the same thing. For 6 months, Claire and I existed in a strange, suspended arrangement that neither of us had planned for or particularly wanted. Legally separated but not yet divorced, Jack splitting his nights carefully between my new apartment near Bull Street and the house Claire kept living in, the same house with the wraparound porch I'd redesigned myself years earlier. We were civil, mostly, for Jack's sake, if nothing else. We attended his soccer games sitting 3 folding chairs apart, close enough to look normal to the other parents, far enough apart that neither of us had to pretend anything more than that. There was one particular Sunday, about 3 months in, when Jack asked, completely out of nowhere, while we were both there watching him at practice, why Mom and Dad didn't sit together anymore the way Tommy's parents did. Claire and I exchanged a look over his head, the first genuinely honest look we'd shared in weeks, and I told him, as simply as I could manage, Sometimes grown-ups need some space to figure things out, bud. It's not about you. It's never been about you. He seemed to accept that, in the uncomplicated way 9-year-olds can sometimes accept even difficult things, and ran back onto the field before either of us had to say anything more complicated. Claire kept finding reasons to delay the actual signature on those 3 pages of paperwork. A conversation she said she still needed to have. A question about how we'd eventually divide the house. Once, memorably, an entire hour spent debating what should happen to the lake house. The same one. I finally understood with a strange, cold clarity that had never really been about the lake house at all. Not the first time she'd said those 5 words, and not this time either. And then, finally, on a Tuesday evening in early spring, almost exactly 6 months after that night at the kitchen table, Claire showed up at my apartment door holding a bottle of wine I hadn't invited, wearing the navy dress she knew I'd always loved on her, and asked for one more night together before everything between us became final and permanent. I stood there in my own doorway a long moment, feeling the pull of 12 years and a version of her I'd genuinely loved for most of my adult life, feeling it in my chest the way you feel weight settle into a structure you designed yourself. Claire, I said finally, my hand still resting on the edge of the door, if I say yes tonight, I need you to understand clearly that it doesn't change what happens tomorrow. The papers still need to be signed this week. This isn't a reconciliation, and I need you to hear that before you come inside, not after. I know, she said, though something flickering across her face suggested she'd been quietly hoping, right up until the exact moment I said those words out loud, that it might somehow turn into one anyway. I didn't let her in that night. I want to be honest with you about how close I actually came. Closer than I'd expected, standing in that doorway with 12 years of shared memory pulling at me harder and more persistently than I'd prepared for. The smell of her perfume alone nearly undid every careful decision I'd made over the previous 6 months. But somewhere across that long, strange stretch of separation, I'd finally learned the real difference between missing a marriage and simply wanting the actual, unresolved, still hurting person standing in front of me on a porch, and I understood, finally, standing there, that I only genuinely missed the first one. I think you should go home, Claire, I said, and I think you should sign the papers this week. Not for me, for yourself. I don't believe either one of us actually gets to heal while this stays open between us. She cried a little, standing there on my small apartment porch, the unopened bottle of wine still held loosely in one hand like she'd forgotten she was carrying it. And then, after a long moment, she left. She signed the papers 11 days later, in Ruth's office, without asking me to be there. I understand something now that took me most of that entire year to fully arrive at. I hadn't been building a genuine marriage across those 12 years so much as I'd been carefully keeping the peace inside one, mistaking the comfortable absence of conflict for the actual presence of real closeness. I wasn't the reason Claire chose Tyler. That particular choice belonged entirely to her, rooted in fears about abandonment that predated me by 3 full decades and were never mine to fix, no matter how much I might have wanted to fix them for her. But I understand now, with a clarity I didn't have a year ago, that a marriage built mostly on comfortable not asking leaves exactly the kind of quiet, undefended silence that someone else can eventually walk into and be mistaken, even briefly, for warmth. Jack asked me, a few weeks after the divorce fully finalized, while we were building an elaborate dinosaur skeleton model together at my kitchen table, whether I still loved his mom. I think I always will, a little, I told him, because it felt like the most honest answer available to give an honest 9-year-old's honest question. But loving someone and being married to them aren't always exactly the same thing, but sometimes the kindest thing 2 people can do for each other is stop trying to force them to be the same thing. He nodded slowly, like that particular answer satisfied something quiet inside him, and went back to carefully fitting a small plastic ribcage into place. I sat there across the table from my son, in an apartment that was slowly, unmistakably starting to feel genuinely like mine instead of a temporary stopover, and felt something I honestly hadn't expected to feel this soon. Not triumph, nothing nearly that dramatic or clean. Just a kind of low, unhurried steadiness, the first real version of it I'd felt in almost a full year. I sleep better now than I did during any of those 6 suspended, in-between months. I've started running again along the river most mornings, something I'd quietly given up years earlier when the business got busy and conflict avoidance slowly, invisibly became my entire personality instead of just one flaw living inside a larger person. There's a particular quiet in my chest most mornings now, standing alone making coffee before Jack wakes up for school, that simply wasn't there for a very long time. Not happiness exactly, nothing that needs a name that big. Something steadier than that. Something closer to being fully myself again, without having to manage anyone else's unfinished decision while I did it. Claire and I are civil now, genuinely civil, mostly for Jack's sake, but not entirely. Some real, if smaller, version of care has survived between us, the way I understand it sometimes does. I hear, secondhand through Monica now and then, that Claire's been in real therapy since the divorce finalized. Actual sustained work, apparently, about her father, about the fear she finally said out loud once, completely, at my kitchen table that Friday night. I hope that's true. I genuinely hope she finds whatever she was actually searching for underneath everything else, because it was never going to be waiting for her in a hotel room, no matter how many times she went looking there. I didn't need that door to be locked forever to understand it needed to close. I just needed it closed cleanly, once, deliberately, instead of held half open for 6 more uncertain months, with neither one of us fully, honestly living on either side of it. The most painful contradiction sitting at the center of this story isn't the affair itself. It's that Claire told the truth completely, without flinching, the night she was finally caught, and still couldn't bring herself to sign 3 pages of paperwork for 6 more months afterward. Confession and closure, it turns out, are not remotely the same act. A person can be entirely, thoroughly honest about what they did, and still be almost completely unable to accept what that honesty ultimately cost them to finish. There's something worth sitting within how that second phone sat dead in the glove compartment for 2 full weeks before David finally charged it. That delay wasn't simple cowardice. It was the last remaining stretch of a marriage where not knowing still felt, barely, survivable. The exact moment he plugged that phone in was the moment survivable quietly stopped being an option at all, and everything that followed moved afterward on a different, considerably faster clock than anything before it. What elevates Claire's fear beyond a simple excuse is how specifically, how concretely it traces all the way back to a 10-year-old girl standing alone in a driveway. That specificity doesn't make her choice forgivable in any conventional sense. It makes it legible. A woman who spent 3 decades quietly terrified of being left behind, unconsciously arranging her entire adult life so she'd never again be the one standing perfectly still while someone else's car disappeared around a corner, even if achieving that meant becoming, inside her own marriage, the one who effectively left first. David's final, quiet refusal on his own apartment porch is the real turning point of this entire story, more significant even than the initial discovery. Nearly anyone can react, in the moment, to being betrayed. It takes something else entirely, something steadier, harder one. To stand in a doorway with 12 full years of shared memory reaching directly for you, and still choose the version of yourself who finally, clearly knows the real difference between missing a marriage and simply wanting the person who broke it.